In the midst of the Palestine conflict, this is a short 3-paragraph letter written on November 2nd, 1970, by Britain's Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to a British Jewish community leader, Walter Rothschild. The resulting dispute will be fought for the next 100 years. Perhaps even the British government did not know who was wrong between Israel and Palestine, who was right. What is the dispute between them, and what is the role of the British government in all this?
Welcome back to W News PK Videos viewers. This topic is one of the most controversial topics in the world, and I will try my best to remain neutral and only talk about facts and figures so that no one could object. There was no conflict in Palestine before World War I. The population of Muslims was high, but Jews and Christians lived happily with them. At that time, the entire area was under the control of the Ottoman Empire. If you look at the map, the Ottoman Empire was spread over a large part of Europe, Western Africa, and the Middle East, which is called the Ottoman Empire. There were some Arab leaders who were tired of the role of the Ottoman Empire, wanted to be freed from and to achieve this goal. They secretly met the Britishers, enemies of the Ottoman Empire. The Britishers promised them that if they would help them in the war against the Ottoman Empire, the Azad Desh will be given a similar promise to the Jews in Europe.
A similar promise was made by the British to the Jews in Europe. From the beginning, the Jews have been a people who had no fixed abode in the world. That is, they had no country of their own. They were called a minority wherever they lived. Jews in Europe were already facing a lot of problems. They were looked at with hatred, and in many places they were even killed. But why was this behind them? There is a religious conflict. For many centuries, Christians believed that the Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus Christ. But because of this conflict, Christianity in Europe did not tolerate Judaism, and it spread throughout the world. The network of the Jewish community is as strong as it was strong before. They used to call the movement to get their own country in Palestine as Zionism. This movement was started in 1896 by a Jewish political activist named Kev Dor Herzl. He had written a book, the translation of which in English is The Jewish State. In it, he also wrote that if the Jews in Europe want to live a peaceful life, they must start their own country in Palestine. Many Jews were against this concept. They used to say that why should we leave our country because of anti-Semitism, that is, hatred against Jews. But soon this movement turned into a political form of Jews around the world. They began to turn to Holstein. They were funded by their own community. They were also given money to set up businesses and factories there. The British government had promised them, the European Union, that they would give them the opportunity to create their own country in Palestine. Fast forward to 1970, World War I was underway, with the Ottoman Empire suffering a crushing defeat. On November 2nd, 1970, Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, wrote a letter to the head of the British Jewish community, Milton Rothschild, stating that the British government had decided that the Jews should form their own country in Palestine, convincing Ruth style. It was stated that the British government would give them full support for this work, and it was also written that it would not harm the Muslims already living here. A month after Balfour wrote the letter, British soldiers came and occupied Palestine and ended the 400-year rule of the Ottoman Empire. Actually, the only thing the British want is that after the departure of the Ottoman Empire, there will be a state that can support them in the future by becoming their god. That's why they promised a separate country to the Jews. But in return, a promise was also taken from the Jews that they would not leave the side of the British after creating their own country. In the past, it used to be a common practice that the winning country in a war would conquer the next one and establish its rule until the conquered country achieved independence. During World War I, as part of the British Mandate, Palestine came under British control. The British made significant efforts to establish Jewish colonies in the region, and they succeeded in doing so. However, the local Arabs, who were already living in Palestine, believed that the British did not consult them regarding their freedom and rights. In 1919, Arthur Balfour wrote a memorandum in which he mentioned that there was no need to inquire about the preferences of the Arabs living in Palestine regarding the newcomers. From the perspective of the Arabs in Palestine, the law created for the Jews, known as the Balfour Declaration, seemed lenient, and it marked the beginning of Jewish immigration from all over the world to Palestine. They established schools, factories, and even a small army known as the Haganah, with the British government's approval. From the Arab perspective in Palestine, there seemed to be no option but to accept that the British were not working for their independence, but instead were giving away their land to others. For a few years they endured, but in 1939 the Arabs there started to raise their voice, but to raise their voice before the Britishers only meant treason. The Arabs of Palestine were severely punished for doing so. Expelled from Palestine, and some were executed, but still the Palestinian Arabs did not end their strike. The British government set up an appeal commission to settle the matter. This commission came up with a solution to the crisis in Palestine, that Palestine should be divided into two parts. This solution was also not accepted by the Arabs of Palestine, because actually the crisis was about why Palestine is being divided. Their strike continued until 1939, when the white paper was released by the British government. In this white paper, the British government published a policy that took into account the past 20 years of Palestine's achievements and first rejected the Peel Commission. In addition to the Arab strike ended, new Jewish immigrants to Palestine were banned, and the Jews who were already in Palestine were also prevented from buying Arab land. Within the next 10 years, Palestine should be made an independent state, and the same would be the home country of the Jewish people. For Zions, this white paper was nothing less than a deception. This white paper first created conflict between the Jews and the Britishers. They refused to accept the white paper and started attacking the British government throughout Palestine, including many local Palestinians were also killed. These attacks continued for several months, but then something bigger happened that grabbed everyone's attention. World War II started in 1939, where this war took the lives of 60 million people worldwide, and Hitler brutally killed 6 million European Jews in his death games. This event is called the Holocaust. Between 1941 and 1945, 66% of the Jews living in Europe were killed by Hitler, leaving the surviving Jews with no other option but to go to Palestine, because it was a very holy place for them, and the Jewish community there first was inhabited by. They started migrating to Palestine despite the immigration restrictions imposed by the British. But where were the conditions in Palestine? There the Zionists were still fighting the British against the white paper. After World War II, the British were tired and no longer had the courage to fight against the Zionists in Palestine, so in 1947 they decided to leave. And they put their spread in Palestine in the throat of the United Nations that now you should come up with a solution to this problem. At that time, the number of Jews in Palestine was 630,000, while there were 143,000 Christians and 1,181,000 Muslims. These figures were given by an Italian Jewish demographer. At that time, the Muslim population was clearly double that of the Jews, but the United Nations proposed to give 55, percent of the land to the Jews in the partition plan of Palestine, in the United Nations General Assembly. This proposal received 72% votes, and it was finalized that 55% of the land of Palestine will be given to the Jews. While the United Nations has never given an explanation that only 30% of the Jews will get 55% of the land. How was it given? At that time, India was also present in the UN Assembly, and India also voted against this decision. The then PM Jawaharlal Nehru raised a lot of voices against the UN decision and said that in case Indian ambassador was bribed by the Zionists, that they should vote in favor of them. This resolution of the UN was rejected by all the Arab countries, and now Zionists and Palestinians have come to the fore in Palestine. Both sides began to attack each other, but the Israeli military was strong enough so the Palestinians could not fight them. On 14th of 1948, David Ben-Gurion announced the establishment of the official state of Israel. He became the first PM of Israel. Had done in 1948, all the member Arab countries decided to attack Israel together because firstly they had already voted against it in the UN, and secondly they saw this as a new way for the British to occupy our country. It was the first Arab-Israeli war in which 5 Arab countries attacked a small Israel that was only a few months old, but Israel had the support of Western countries and, in fact, they had a strong enough military, so Israel alone defeated 5 Arab countries. After the end of the war, the areas that the UN had chosen for Palestine were now occupied by Israel, and the West Bank was occupied by Jordan. And the Gaza Strip is under the control of Egypt. Another Arab-Israeli war broke out in 1967, in which Israel occupied not only the West Bank but also the Gaza Strip and the entire Sinai Peninsula of Egypt. In the midst of all this, the people of Palestine want to create their own country. For this purpose, they created a separate organization called the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. In the beginning, by taking up these weapons, they try to consider their country as a separate country. In order to raise their voices, PLO also hijacked many planes and ships. That's why the United States and Israel declared PLO a terrorist organization. Gaia and many countries did not consider the PLO as a terrorist organization. In 1974, the PLO was officially recognized by the United Nations as the representative of the Palestinian people, after which the peace talks between Egypt and Israel were successful in 1979, and Egypt became the first Arab country. After Israel officially recognized Israel, Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, but 2 years later, the Egyptian Prime Minister was assassinated by extremist groups. How did they come to an agreement with Israel? Because of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank for so long, many Jews start building their homes there as well, but the international community objects to this because it was originally a 1947 United Nations settlement. Contrary to the partition plan, the area of the West Bank was originally reserved for Palestine, but Israel also occupied it and began to settle its own people there. In 1992, peace talks again took place between Israel and the PLO. PLO leader Yasser Arafat also recognizes Israel, and Israeli PM Yitzhak Rabin also recognizes PLO and admits that PLO is not a terrorist organization. Another wing of them that wants no compromise with Israel becomes what is known as Hamas. On the other hand, the extremist group of Israel also goes against its PM and says that there should be no compromise with Palestine, but it does not matter to the peace talks. They try to solve it, but the problem was that a lot of Israelis have built their houses in the West Bank, that too by the will of the Israeli government. So the solution was that the West Bank will be divided into 3 parts: A, B and C. Area A will be under the control of Palestine only. Area B will be under the control of both. And Area C will be under the control of Israel only. That after which the peace talks between Egypt and Israel were successful in 1979, and Egypt became the first Arab country. The Palestinians only got a few pieces in the West Bank where they could run their own government. The non-PLO accepted it as well. But then something suddenly happened in 1995 that shattered all the peace talks. The Jews extremist group killed their own prime minister. They didn't want any Palestinians in the West Bank at any cost. In 1996, Palestine held its first elections and the first government of Palestine was formed, but Hamas, the militant wing of Palestine, was not happy about this and boycotted the elections. Not only that, but he also carries out several suicide bombings in Israel, which greatly increases the already hatred between Israelis and Palestinians. After this incident, the clashes between the two continue to occur. In order to avoid this, Israel built a concrete wall around its settlements in the West Bank, which made it more difficult for Palestinians to live there. Then in 2006, elections are held again in Palestine, and this time Hamas wins. A civil war erupts between the PLO party Fatah and Hamas, and Palestine is split into two parts, with Hamas holding the Gaza Strip and smaller pieces in the West Bank, the PLO, Fatah's government. In most of the clashes between Israel and Hamas, rockets are fired at Israel from the same Gaza Strip. That is why Israel has built a huge fence around the Gaza Strip. But every second, third year, Hamas and Israel's war intensifies again. The last time this happened was in 2021, and now on October 7th, 2023, Hamas fired more than 5,000 rockets at Israel. And the conflict in Palestine, which has changed its shape over the past 100 years and makes its presence felt till today. I have tried to cover this topic very carefully with only facts and figures without targeting any religion. What is your opinion about this topic?